following on from tutorials IV028 and IV027, which introduced the concept of advanced groups in Invent, this tutorial looks at a few examples of how these can be configured and what effects they have on the final group when transferred to a MegaEdit product. We will do this by working our way through the alignment options that are provided by Infigo. So if I just click on one of the groups I've pre-made, you'll see that we have a range of alignment and distribution of spacing settings, and we'll just use these as a guide. Now, these are just examples of how they can be configured, with the margins and the sizing of each field fully configurable by the template builder. So in each of our examples, we have two text fields, just side by side. Next to those, we have an image field, and then they are all placed within an empty image frame, which is defined as our boundary of the group. Now, we've explained how to set all this up in one of the earlier tutorials. So we will begin within InDesign itself, and we'll just select the group that we want to look at. We'll work our way through the alignment, spacing, and gap options provided by default. Now, these cover many scenarios. However, please do remember, just as a reminder, that the margins and sizing of each field are completely customizable should you want to deviate from these examples. Okay, so our first example will be left aligned. So with our group selected and align left selected, this will automatically modify the margin and size options of the fields contained within the group. So I'm going to click on the advanced settings for the three fields in the group, just so we can see what has been specified automatically. So for this first example, let's take a look at each of the fields in turn so we can understand exactly what it's doing. And then for later examples, we'll go through it at a much faster pace. We'll start by looking at the left text field, so this frame here. Now for the left margin of that left text field, we have a set value of 0. And this will ensure that this field sits right up against the boundary. As this is the field at the top of the list, it's considering that to be the leftmost in our horizontal configuration. So that left side of the text frame there will sit right up against the boundary. Now the right margin of this left text field is set to self. Now this will pick up and set the current margin between this and the next field as it's currently set inside InDesign. So what this means, we've got self selected, it's saying 4.5 millimeters. It's calculated that there's a 4.5 millimeter gap between these two fields, and that will be maintained. And then finally, we have the size option. Again, that's been automatically set to self, meaning that the field will retain its current width as it's seen in InDesign. Now let's take a look at our right text frame. We're still looking at the left alignment. Now what we see here, this field is in the middle of our list, surrounded by other fields in the group on either side. This means that the field has no direct link to the external boundary. All margins and size options are set to self here, ensuring that the field's current size and its gap sizes, its margin sizes, are maintained as they currently are in InDesign. So what we mean is that this width of the frame will be maintained, and then the gap here and the gap here will also be maintained as they are in InDesign. And then finally, our image field that we have here. So let's expand the option for this one. Now our image field is the last field in our list. And this means, with our horizontal configuration as we have it, that it's the right margin that will interact with the right external boundary of the group. As a result, both the left margin and the size are set to self to ensure that the current spacing and width are maintained. The right margin, however, is set to auto. This ensures that the right margin is adaptable based on the available space. As we are left aligning the fields within the group, it makes sense that the margin to the right of the fields should be adjustable based on that available space. So now let's take a look at that same group when transferred to a MegaEdit product. Now I'm going to enable a debugging mode here so we can actually see the boundaries of those fields. This makes it a little bit clearer for the purposes of this example. So looking at the left alignment, we see that the specification for this group has been successfully applied. The left text field is pushed up against the boundary, with the other fields moving with it to maintain the specified gaps between the fields. The sizing of the fields has also been maintained based on the fields that we've seen in InDesign. We can also see that the spacing to the right of the image field has been allowed to adapt due to that auto setting. Right, so now we've gone through our first example, let's take a more streamlined look at some of the other examples of positional and sizing specifications. We'll work down this list. Next is right aligned. That's where we've just clicked on the align right setting when configuring our group. So as we can see in these configuration options, the right aligned option applies a self constraint to all but the extreme left and the extreme right margins, which both sit against the external boundary. The left is set to auto and the right is set to a defined value of 0. This ensures the group's fields always stay pressed against the right side boundary. The self-constraint on most of the margins and sizing ensures the original values from InDesign are maintained. So let's switch to our MegaEdit product to see the result. We see that the fields have been shifted to the right side of the boundary, the spacing between the fields has been maintained, and the space to the left of the boundary has successfully adapted based on the available space. Next, let's have a look at center aligned. So this is where we've clicked the align center option here. Now this option applies a self constraint to all but the extreme left and right margins, which, as we know, both sit against the boundary. Both the extreme left and right margins are set to auto with a weighting value of 1. This ensures that the available space is evenly distributed between the extreme left and right margins. The self-constraint on most of the other margins and sizing ensures that the original values from InDesign are maintained. So let's once again go into MegaEdit, take a look at that. So we've got this central alignment section here. This centralization is controlled by the auto spacing that we've specified on the extreme left and right margins. By applying an equal weighting to both of those external margins, we ensure the space between each of them remains the same, so all of the fields are centralized. Okay, next up is space between. So this is this option here. So this applies a set value of 0 to the extreme margins at either end. Each of the interior margins is set to auto with a distribution of 1, ensuring the spacing is equal for all of the specified auto margins. This will ensure that the outermost fields are flush against the boundary, with the remaining fields being positioned based on the available space amongst those internal fields. Let's once again take a look at this. So space between, we can see the desired behavior has been achieved. So the extreme left and right margins are fixed against that boundary due to the set value of 0, whilst the internal fields have been positioned based on the available space to the margins set to auto. As the weighting of the auto margins is set to 1, it ensures equal spacing in each of these. Next, let's have a look at space around, which is this option here. So this applies auto spacing to each of the margins. So we can see a lot of auto spacing. So this applies auto spacing to each of the margins, both internal and external. All of the interior margins have a weighting of 1, as the gap between two fields will consist of 2 times this weighting. So that's explained in more detail in a different tutorial with the ID IV028. The 2 extreme exterior margins will have a weighting of 2, as there is only 1 margin at play in that gap instead of the 2 margins that are at play between the actual fields themselves. This means the end result, the spacing in each gap, interior and exterior, will be equal. Once again, let's take a look. Space around. With this setup, there's an equal spacing between every field in the group and the margins and the outer boundaries. Okay, another option we have here is gap. So when you click on the gap option, it asks you to specify a gap that you want to create based on a unit that you've got selected. This is a one-size-fits-all input. By clicking gap and entering a value, you will apply this as a statically sized gap between all of the fields. So we can see what this does. We see here that a value has been applied to all margins. All are set to 0 except those margins which meet another field in the group. Instead, those have been set to our specified gap. So if we look at the gap between left text field and right text field, for example, we can see that the right margin of left text field is set to 0, and the left margin of right text field is set to 10. And that means the total gap between those will be 10 points in this case. So let's go over and take a look at that. And we can see that that behavior has been achieved. We've got a 10-point gap in this case between those fields. Now, the last example to look at here is a little bit different. It's sized by content. Now, this isn't available to the margins. This is just to the fields themselves. And it means that we can adjust the size of the fields based on the content that we have contained within them. And it's both text fields and image fields. If I go and expand my options there, you can see for each of these size options, I've gone to the content option. And what this means is that if we start resizing one of those frames, depending on what we specified as the margin options, other fields will start to move. So if we start to put a lot more text in one of those fields, for example, and push it size-wise to the right, that gap will be maintained, so the other fields are going to move as well. So let's take a look at this in action. So we've got this size by content section here. If I start applying more text to the left, we can see that all the other fields move out of the way to maintain the gap.